All right, howdy eggs. We're back with the last part, probably the last 70% of our lecture related to biomechanics and the anatomical reference system. So welcome back. Here's my beat the hell out of COVID-19 mask. So those are important for everybody wear out there when you are outside. Because when everybody wears them, it reduces the RO, that's the transmissibility, from about a 2.0, which means that for every person's infected, they can give the disease COVID-19 to at least 2 people. That means a doubling effect, so it works almost, I hate to say, like bacteria, and it just takes off. So that's the thing we really get concerned about, is that doubling effect. When everybody wears it, the RO is down to 0.3. So that's quite a bit. That's 2.5 and roughly about 2, 6. That's 6 or 7 times less infectious. And then the chances are, if you do get infected, you'll have what we call a low viral dose. So chances are your immune system might be able to catch up with it. And not only you, but everybody in your family. So stay safe out there. We've been opening back up. I'm filming this in June. So hopefully when you guys see it in July, things are still going okay. There's been a bit of an uptake lately, and I get concerned that not enough people are wearing the masks and practicing their social distancing out there. So we're all in it together. So let's try to get through it together. So back to biomechanics, we're going to be looking at directional terms first of all. And these terms come in pairs, are pretty straightforward. I've had to kind of redo some of my slides because normally I would actually stand up in front of the class and then we would all do this together. So you can stand up and go through some of these motions and movements at home. But I've had to add a bit in terms of some of our photos and illustrations. So I think that's going to work out as we move forward. So let's start to work with these terms because we're going to be using them throughout the class. Superior versus inferior. So superior meaning towards the head, towards the top of the body. Inferior meaning downwards or towards the feet. So for example, if we compare the navel with the knee, the navel would be superior and the knee would be inferior. If we compare the shoulder and the elbow would be inferior, the shoulder joint would be superior, the glenohumeral joint. Anterior versus posterior. Anterior meaning directing towards the front of the body, posterior meaning directing towards the back. So if we compare the scapula, for example, with the pectoralis major, the scapula is going to be posterior, pectoralis major is going to be anterior. If you compare, let's say, the navel and then the spine is going to be posterior, the navel is going to be anterior. So pretty straightforward for the most part. We've got some additional directional terms to make sure we understand. Medial versus lateral, medial meaning towards the inside, towards the midline of the body, lateral meaning towards the outside. So there are 2 strong collateral ligaments at the elbow. There is a medial collateral ligament, which prevents abduction, and a lateral collateral ligament, which prevents adduction of the elbow joint. The elbow joint's a true hinge joint. It has 1 degree of freedom, 1 axis of rotation. It's supposed to only move in 1 plane. We don't want it to move in the frontal plane. Proximal versus distal. These are terms related to the arms and the legs, and then whether or not a part of the arm or leg is closer to the trunk or farther away from the trunk. Proximal means closer, distal means farther away. So if we compare, for example, the hand and then the elbow, the hand would be distal, the elbow would be proximal. If we compare the knee And the ankle joint, again, the knee is going to be proximal, the ankle is going to be distal. Superficial versus deep. Superficial meaning near the surface, so the pectoralis major is near the surface, so are the deltoid muscles. They're superficial muscles. If we think about the quadriceps group, which would have the vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis, the rectus femoris, and then the vastus intermedius. The vastus intermedius is the only deep muscle. It's actually underneath the rectus femoris. The vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, they are superficial muscles as well as the rectus femoris. So hopefully those are pretty straightforward. We're going to be using human anatomy, not cats or dogs, so keep that in mind. Some of the terms are a bit different. We don't use caudal, for example. Oh, and I should probably point out, now that I'm thinking about it, the foot has a dorsal aspect, that's on top, okay? And then a plantar aspect, that's on the bottom. So when we talk about dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, that's going to be important there. Okay, so the next thing we need to do as we're preparing and to talk about anatomy and using it. So in our class in biomechanics, whether we're utilizing mathematics or anatomy or physiology, for us, we're getting at function and how we can use this. So this is kind of interesting because a lot of the early thoughts about biomechanics, all the way from Aristotle to Borelli, were based on, for the most part, simple machines. Borelli brought the mathematics up and tried to show causal relationships using mathematics. We're going to be doing that in this class as well. We're going to be using formulas to actually explain what's going on. For the most part, we're going to use very simple formulas. It's really important for you guys along the way to remember, rememorize, and use these equations. So that way, this mathematics becomes a language rather than just something you maybe look up on the internet every once in a while. It should be something that you use, just like your English language. And it actually makes the math a lot easier. And the fact that you guys are going to be collecting data makes a big difference. I think that's going to help a great deal in terms of learning the subject. So, excuse me. So we'll start with some very simple machines, a wheel and an axle. An axle or an axis is a line around which rotation occurs. A wheel is an object that's usually round that tends to rotate about that axis. We could think about a person's legs as being like wheels because they're rotating around the knee joint, hip joint, etc. So simple pulley. A pulley is a simple machine that changes the direction of a force but doesn't change its magnitude. There's a complex pulley that's called a block and tackle, which you can use to lift very heavy objects. It's not a simple pulley, meaning a single pulley with a wire or a cable or a rope going around it. This type of pulley only changes the direction. So here's the load. So let's pretend this is 150 pounds. So we're pulling up with 150 pounds. That force, which is directed downwards, is going to go around this pulley. And now it's going to be directed upwards. It looks like about a 60-degree angle. So that force is basically now going down towards this individual as they're pulling. So the same thing, this is a lat pull down machine. So we've got a stack of weights. The force is pointing down, gravity's pointing down. And so that force vector is now going across with these two simple pulleys and then going up from this individual who's doing the lift or doing the weight. Part of the body that can act like a pulley is the patella. So the patella, as you guys know, is in front of the knee joint. The quadriceps muscle through the quadriceps tendon is attached to it. And then the patella is attached to the patella tendon and eventually the tibia. What it's doing is it's changing the direction. Check this out. It's changing the direction of the force, which normally is going, looks like it's horizontal as we have it pictured here. It's going around that patella, which is acting like a pulley, and changes the direction. That's an advantage for a couple of reasons. In fact, in humans, you probably notice the patella is actually kind of about 2 inches or so in front of the middle of the knee. In a dog or a cat, Trixie up, Trixie. So here's Trixie right here. Hello. So let's see your patella. Let's see it. Come here, Trixie. There we, oh, I got your patella right here. Oh, it's tiny. You got a small one. I don't want to hurt you. Okay. So the Trixie's got a really small patella. It's barely in front of the knee. So in a dog or a cat or a horse, when they're pushing off with their hind legs, a lot of what they're doing is they're doing hip extension and hyperextension, and then they got a lot of plantar flexion in the ankle. And so with the ankle joint in a dog, what we see, watch out. What we see is it's a very, very long foot, and they kind of walk on their toes, just like an elephant walks on their toes. So that's a simple pulley, a simple machine. Another type of simple machine is a lever system. Our body is made out of lots and lots of lever systems. So whether it's the femur or tibia or humerus, radius, and ulna, they indeed can function a lot like levers. So there are 3 types of lever systems: first class, second class, and third class. First class is like a seesaw. Our body is mostly third class levers. Second class levers are ideal in terms of producing a lot of torque. Third class levers produce large movements and then rapid movements, especially against the light load. Oh, a wedge, something that can chop or slice, something that produces shear forces that you might see with shaving, chopping wood, tackling, blood velocity, for example, through an artery or arteriole is producing what we call fluid shear forces. And then related to axis of rotation. So this is an axis around which movement's occurring. It could be a joint, it could be the shoulder, it could be elbow, it could be the knee joint, it could be the trunk here for a golfer. It could be, let's see if we can move this forward. No, a basketball player dunking, for example, it could be movement of the shoulder and hand. As we're looking at a cyclist, we might be looking at, for example, we could be looking at someone cycling, and we've got the hip joint here, the knee joint, and then the ankle joint. We could be analyzing this. It looks like this was done to dartfish. So we have the dartfish program. And then along the way, when we're talking about the human movement system, something that's really important to the health of tendons, ligaments, cartilage, etc., are material properties. And that means things like strength, stiffness, ductility, elasticity, toughness, resilience. They're the material properties that determine the integrity and actually the health of materials. So we test them the same way we test steel and concrete. So bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments can be tested in that manner. There are different types of loads or stresses that we can test: pulling stress, compression or squeezing stress, bending stress, shear stress, torsion, etc. Those are all really, really important in different types of loads. So 5 different types of loads: pulling, pushing, bending force, that's doing something like that. Shear force is a cutting or chopping or sliding force. Torsion means twisting like that. So we've got different types of forces. So as we start to look at anatomical analysis and the anatomical reference system, the next thing we want to look at is the anatomical position, So this is the origin. This is the reference position. So that's why these are reference systems. Each one has a reference or an origin. So anatomical position is that. The hands are down at the side. The palms are facing outwards like that. And we think of the shoulder, elbow, neck, torso, hip joint, knee joint, ankle joint, etc., as being roughly at a 180-degree or straight angle. The exception here you can see is, of course, the ankle. So the ankle is probably pretty close to 90 degrees right there. But any type of movement and plane that we're going to talk about in axes is going to be related to the anatomical position. And when you're doing analysis, if you get confused, just imagine putting the torso back into the anatomical position. Either you tilt your head or you move the object, or you just imagine in your mind that that torso is back there. And when I'm doing analysis, I start with more central axes first, like the spine and the hips and the shoulder, and then move out distally to the periphery. And maybe start with the spine and go with the shoulder and then elbow joint and then wrist joint in my analysis. There are three basic or cardinal planes of motion, and they are, we'll take out the anatomy book as a demonstration, the sagittal plane, that's a front to back plane, and then the frontal plane, side to side plane, and the transverse plane that kind of divides the body into top and bottom halves. Any rotation occurs around the y-axis for the transverse plane. For the frontal plane, it's going to be a z-axis when we have rotation. For the sagittal plane, it's going to rotate about an x-axis. So x, z, and y, if you're following along. And here are those cardinal axes. So the x-axis, sometimes called the medial lateral axis, is going to go from left to right, and it's going to be perpendicular with the sagittal plane. The y-axis is going to go from top to bottom, and it's going to be perpendicular with, we call it the transverse plane as opposed to the horizontal plane, but it is horizontal. And then the frontal plane is going to be perpendicular with that z-axis. So since they're perpendicular, we're going to be looking at 90 degrees or right angles. Okay, so the x-axis, again, passes from side to side. Here we see someone doing fast-pitch softball, one of our Aggies. And that means that that shoulder is going to be rotating around that x-axis and in the sagittal plane, Here's someone doing shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, and shoulder hyperextension. Around the y-axis, we might see someone doing a pirouette, horizontal adduction, that's movement like this, if you're doing something like a bench press or throwing an object. Horizontal abduction, moving the shoulder back in the transverse plane. Movement around the z-axis could be a somersault. It could be jumping jacks, or it could be a cartwheel. And the next thing we want to talk about are degrees of freedom. So this is the number of axes a joint or movement can rotate through. An elbow joint, for example, is 1 degree of freedom. The shoulder is 3 degrees of freedom. So it can move in all three planes. Sagittal plane can move in the transverse plane. In the transverse plane, you can get medial and lateral rotation as well. And also, what did I forget? Oh, the frontal plane. So abduction and adduction. It's a true ball and socket joint. The wrist joint has 2 degrees of freedom, 2 axes of rotation. It's an oval joint. So I can do flexion and extension, as well as radial and ulnar deviation. And indeed, if we look at the articulation between the radius and the scaphoid bone and the lunate bone, then what you actually see is a oval shape with a long and a short axis. So across the short axis, you get greater freedom of movement, but less protection. You're more likely to get hyperflexion and hyperextension type injuries. With this type of movement, like the queen waving, so that would be radial and ulnar deviation. That's along the long axis of the wrist joint, and that means there's actually more stability, but the sacrifice, the trade-off, is less freedom of movement. And biomechanics is almost always a trade-off. Sometimes we get our cake and eat it too, and I'll show you when that happens, but a lot of times there's a trade-off. Now, the interesting thing about the knee joint is the knee joint is not a hinge joint. A lot of people think about it as the hinge joint. Here's the femur. They're two epicondyles that are going to interface or articulate with the tibia and the fibula. So most of the contact is going to be right on top of the tibia. There are two indentations on either side, an intercondylar eminence in the middle. And these indentations in the tibia are concave in shape. And you can see that the femur has two convex shaped oval parts of the bone that will articulate. So I'm going through my stuff because I think I've got the humors. I think I've got a tibia model, but I may be mistaken. That may still be up at school. I'm afraid so. Sorry, but in the tibia, there are two oval-shaped indentations where the two epicondyles of the femur fit in, and so it makes it a double oval or double condyloid joint. So one of the ramifications, what's the importance of that? Is it just trivia? No, not really. What it means is because an oval joint doesn't have 1 degree of freedom like a hinge joint does or a pivot joint. It has 2 degrees of freedom. That means that the knee joint is not a simple hinge joint, just doesn't move in one plane. So for sure, we get sagittal plane movement in terms of flexion and extension, but you also get with the knee joint some transverse plane movement as well. And this really helps when someone, for example, is walking. And when they land, your foot has to be underneath your center of gravity. And then as you kind of roll over that knee in kind of a reverse pivot, or better said, a reverse pendulum, then you have to have some rotation of the knee that allows the femur to come over the tibia. So there's a bit of rotation built in. So it's actually really important when you're walking. Most people have about 40 degrees range of motion. If you hold your thigh or your upper leg steady and then try to rotate your leg, you'll probably notice about 40, 50 degrees range of motion. So as I've gotten older, I noticed that range of motion has decreased a bit. That's usually not a type of joint where you do flexibility exercises like that in the transverse plane. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about basic types of motion at the major joints in the body from the anatomical or back towards the anatomical position in all 3 major planes. So let's talk about that. We've got the sagittal plane. That's for forward and backward movements, like the somersaults, for example. Running or shooting a basketball, those are classic sagittal plane movements. We're going to start with basically the hip joint, the knee, and then moving towards the foot. And then we're also going to start seeing after that some shoulder movement. This is called shoulder flexion, elbow extension, and finally wrist flexion at the end. So a lot of what we do are sagittal plane movements, So here's the kind of greatest of all time in terms of gymnastics, Simone Biles doing a somersault with a twist, by the way. There we go, and landing perfectly. So that's primarily, as we're looking at a sagittal plane movement. When you're cycling, you're moving primarily in the sagittal plane, front to back. And so it means movement at the hip joint, knee joint, ankle joint. Those are sagittal plane movements. You've got extension of the hips, extension of the knee, plantar flexion when you're driving. And then on the way back up, you've got dorsiflexion of the ankle, flexion of the knee, and flexion of the hip joint. So we're going to go through some movements. I have some folks that we filmed back in the day, a few years ago, to help us out as we go. I'm trying to put together actually a lot of photos and pictures to go into the textbook that's nearing completion. And if in the laboratories you want to get involved, let us know. We'll have you sign a sheet and you can be in pictures as well. Okay, so let's start with some sagittal plane movements. Flexion and extension, what the heck is that? Well, start from the anatomical position. Any movement away from the anatomical position in the sagittal plane is called flexion. So whether it's the shoulder doing this, that's flexion. Whether it's the elbow doing that, that's flexion. Whether it's the knee moving in the opposite direction. So this movement upwards like that, that is flexion. A lot of people will say this is an extended arm. It's not. It's a flexed arm caused by rotation of the shoulder in flexion. If we move back to the anatomical position, that's extension of the shoulder. For the knee joint, even though the knee is moving, the lower leg is moving back and the arm's moving front, because we're moving away from the anatomical position, that's knee flexion. And as we move back, that's extension. One of the things to remember is that when a body segment moves away from the anatomical position, it's closing that joint, meaning that joint angle is getting smaller. Remember to measure the joint angle on the inside of the joint, not the outside. So as we move up in here, we're measuring it on the inside. That looks like about an 80-degree angle. That's pretty close to 180 there. And we have a 180-degree angle for the knee joint. And then with flexion, that's a little over 90. I'm going to make it about 115 degrees. No, yeah, about 115 degrees, I think. It's not quite a 30-degree angle. And then we've got wrist flexion. Movement in the opposite direction would be extension. So movement away from the anatomical position, flexion. Movement back to the anatomical position is extension. Hyperextension is movement past the anatomical position, whether it's the knee joint, whether it's the ankle, whether it's the shoulder or the hip joint. Here we see an example of a hyperextended hip. Here's an example of a hyperextended spine. When joints are hyperextended or hyperflexed on either end of the range of motion, they're more susceptible to injuries or maybe even have been injured. Here we see kind of a neutral angle for the for the ankle. And as the toes point out, remember this is the dorsal aspect of the foot. Plantar aspect, hopefully you're not ticklish, is on the bottom. So as we move the toes up, that's dorsiflexion. As we move the foot down, that is plantar flexion. For the ankle, we always have exceptions to the rule. As we move through these planes, you're going to start to see more and more exceptions and less of the rule. For up to me, in the sagittal plane, everything would be flexion and extension, and abduction and adduction in the frontal plane, and then medial and lateral rotation in the transverse plane, but afraid not. Okay, so we just talked about hyperextension and dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. The next plane we want to talk about is the frontal plane. So we see someone doing a cartwheel and a dismount, really nice one. The cartwheel is a frontal plane movement. This lat pull down is also a frontal plane movement from a whole body perspective. So we'll start with abduction and adduction, and that means movement of the shoulder or the hip joint away from the anatomical position, away from that anatomical position. That is actually abduction. Adduction is movement back to the anatomical position, Lateral flexion, we see that at the trunk and also the neck. We have left lateral flexion and right lateral flexion. So here we see a little left lateral flexion, a little right lateral flexion, some shrugging right down here, some shrugging of the shoulders. That would be elevation of the shoulder girdle. We also have upward and downward rotation of the shoulder girdle. This happens when you lift your arms in abduction. That's movement away from the anatomical position. Here's left and right lateral flexion. of the neck, and we can, in the torso, we can have left and right lateral flexion as well. At the wrist joint, we talked about radial and ulnar deviation. When the thumb points inward, that's radial deviation. Radius is on the inside, the ulna is on the outside. So part of the thing about elevation and depression of the shoulder girdle, I needed to mention this, is that it puts the clavicle and the sternum at an ideal position to be able to continue to allow abduction and even flexion. If we didn't, then you would actually have some pinching, impingement of some of the tendons around the head of the humerus, especially rotator cuff muscles, would get pinched between the acromion process and the head of the humerus. So dogs and cats really can't do this. If we lift, like for example, we lift our arms like this, you're also going to see like the rhomboid muscles get involved. You're also going to see the scapula and the shoulder girdle moving up like that. And when that happens, that allows the head of the humerus to be able to lift upwards. That gives us tremendous freedom of movement, for example, in the shoulders, so that we can use tools, sometimes climb trees, pull down like fruit from a tree, for example, especially our ancestors. So there's lateral flexion of the trunk. You can have left or right lateral flexion. Finally, transverse plane movements. These are horizontal movements. Rotation is going to be around that Y or vertical axis. So whether it's hitting a backhand shot in tennis or a pirouette. So first we'll start off with medial and lateral rotation. That's kind of the rule, and then you can see all these exceptions. So you can have medial rotation of the shoulder, lateral rotation of the shoulder. If I'm holding, let's say, a tennis racket, we use medial and lateral rotation when we're hitting a serve or maybe an overhand shot. And in golf, you also use medial and lateral rotation of the shoulder, what we call the wrist snap, even though technically the wrists aren't snapping. The movement's actually medial and lateral rotation of the shoulder, and then pronation and supination of the forearm. So if you point your toe inward, that's medial rotation. From the anatomical position, if the thumb points inward, that's medial rotation. If the thumb points outward, that's lateral rotation. Left and right rotation of the neck, trunk, etc. That's where those abdominal obliques come in. Good workout for that. We have pronation and supination of the forearm. When you're in the anatomical position, the forearm is in full supination, If you do something like a chin-up, you keep that elbow and that forearm in full supination, grab that bar and pull up. You notice it's probably easier to do that than an actual pull-up. So a chin-up is easier than a pull-up, and the reason for that is that we've got pronator muscles that produce this type of movement, okay? That's what you would use in a pull-up. But when you do that, the biceps brachii produces elbow flexion, but it also tries to produce supination. So the forearm in a also produces, supination. So when the forearm's in a pronated position, it's also trying to supinate the elbow as well as, or the joint that's near the elbow, which is the proximal radial ulnar joint. It's trying to supinate the forearm as well as flex the elbow. So that's why a pull-up is harder than a chin-up. I think the average American can do one chin-up and 0 pull-ups right now. I'm trying to get in shape so I can do a lot of them again. Way back in the day when I wrestled, I could, but I had a lot less mass. So gravity's taken hold since then. So we can see this is kind of a neutral position, if you can believe that. Here's the supinated position, and here's the pronated position for the forearm. The next term or pairs we'll look at are horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. So let's say you adduct the shoulder. Movement towards the front of the body would be horizontal adduction. Movement towards the back is horizontal adduction. So when you're doing something like a wind-up with a tennis racket, you lift the racket in abduction and then move it back in horizontal abduction. So horizontal adduction is forward. So as you guys are looking at this, the shoulders rotating so that the arm is moving forward. That's horizontal adduction. If we move back, that's horizontal abduction. One of the things to remember is that when you're either determining a movement or doing a calculation in terms of like velocity or acceleration, you'll need at least 2 pictures to do velocity or demonstrate a movement. Just one doesn't do it. 3 to demonstrate and calculate acceleration. Finally, pronation and supination of the ankle. So let's talk about the ankle because it's kind of complex. You guys have heard of like a high ankle sprain, a low ankle sprain. That really refers to these 2 joints. There's a tibio-talar joint. That's the joint that produces dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. It's a true hinge joint. The subtalar joint is an irregular joint. Some people argue that it is an oval or condyloid joint, but we think it's kind of somewhere in between. It's that and kind of a hinge joint. So it can kind of move in 2 planes. So pronation of the ankle happens for most people when they walk. So they'll land, pardon me a second. So they'll land on their heel and kind of roll the foot over so it points outward, that's eversion. And then the bottom of the shoe, sole of the shoe, points outward, so that's abduction. Supination happens when you land on the inside. So people that are a little knock-kneed, this might happen. It's a little more unusual. You land on the inside and the toe points inward, that's inversion, and then the bottom of the shoe points inward, so that is adduction. If there's pronation of the ankle during running, ideally we should land on the midsole or even the front of the foot initially when someone's running, and then especially when they're sprinting. We shouldn't see pronation of the ankle then. We don't want to land on our heel because we've got the calcaneus or heel bone underneath. That's a stiff material. We're not taking advantage of the arch of the human foot. It's a great way to support the body and also to provide cushioning. And we have elastic tissues in there that can store force and energy. So here we see a foot moving towards the inside. So that's supination. And then we see pronation. With pronation, there's excessive pressure on the big toe. When this happens, especially in patients who have diabetes, that means they can have basically a sore or an injury to the foot. And since tissues don't heal as well, that can be a particular problem. Okay, so we're back now. Now that we've gone through the major planes of motion and all the major movements, we can now talk about the anatomical analysis of movement and start using it, because that's what we want to do in biomechanics. Which joints are moving, what type of joint or segment is occurring, which skeletal muscles are contributing to the joint or movement, and then finally, are the muscles contracting concentrically, eccentrically, or isometrically So that's a reminder to talk about now the different types of muscle contractions. I prefer activation instead of contraction. So if you have what we call an isometric contraction, that means that you got a situation, I don't know if you remember Hans and Franz doing isometric contractions. That actually comes from Charles Atlas, who we talked about before, believe it or not. And the idea, again, he was selling isometric exercises in competition with facilities in big cities, especially weight rooms, clubs, gymnasiums, etc. at the time. Isometric contractions mean there's no joint movement. When there's no joint movement, we're governed by the rules and the mathematics of static mechanics. And it says that the sum of the torques, that's the ability to be able to produce rotation. Your muscles are producing torque in one direction. Any resistance, it could be the weight in your hand, it could be impact, it could be antagonist muscles are producing torque in the opposite direction. The sum of the torques equal to 0, so you got no movement whatsoever. It also means that some of the forces in any given direction are also equal to 0 as well. So we'll take advantage of that later. They're isotonic contractions, and that means the muscles changing in length. So if we're lifting a heavy weight or an object, it's not that heavy, but if we're lifting an object, we're producing a concentric contraction, and that means the muscle is shortening. It's producing more torque than the resistances are producing. So there's enough force to be able to produce that concentric contraction. Those are the agonist muscles trying to move the body, move the limb, propel an object, etc. Eccentrical lengthening contractions happen when you're letting a weight down. So when you're doing a squat exercise on the way up, you're contracting the hip extensors, knee extensors, plantar flexors. On the way back down, you don't need to recruit the hip flexors and knee flexors and dorsiflexors that much because gravity's pulling you down. So you use the hip extensors, knee extensors, and plantar flexor muscles, but eccentrically now. You're slowing down the effective movement. Or if you're trying to lift a heavy weight, you can't lift it. Oh, you're doing a maximum bench press. Oh, you can't quite get there. You can let that weight down safely with an eccentric contraction. So eccentric contractions allow us to brake against powerful movements. We have something called a co-contraction, where the antagonist muscles like the triceps and the agonist muscles are contracting at the same time to protect that elbow joint. When you're lifting a heavy weight, you probably notice that not only the agonist muscles contracting, but you're getting more and more contraction from the antagonist muscles. That's actually slowing things down in terms of producing torque. But the idea is to provide more compression and therefore more stabilization at the joint itself. So, for example, the triceps brachii, the biceps brachii, the brachioradialis, the brachialis are all pushing the two ends of the humerus and the ulna and the radius together. By pushing them together and having really good joint cartilage, that provides a nice tight fit. It's less likely to slip, less likely to be able to be affected by shear forces, and more likely to be able to protect those joints. So co-contractions and muscle contractions overall, they not only produce movement, but really importantly, they basically take two articulating bones. It could be the femur and the tibia, press them together. Why is that important? The harder you press those bones with the attached cartilage together, the more stable it is. So I'm going to have you guys try this at home. So put your hands together, loosen up beforehand, put your hands together and very, very lightly, produce very little force between them, and now try to rub them together. This rubbing force is a shear force. It's like a cutting force. So you notice it's pretty easy to do that. You can do that back and forth. Okay, so now press really super hard together. Now try to slide them. You notice it's a lot more difficult. Been doing a lot of yoga lately with my wife and also my dog. She likes to do yoga as well. Usually kind of getting in the way. That's her idea of yoga. And some exercises, some resistive stuff indoors. And I'm trying to work out my shoulders. I'm afraid way back in the day that wrestling's trying to catch up with me. So trying to do some stretching exercises as well. So all of that stuff throughout your lifespan, keep that up because it's going to make a big difference in terms of muscle strength, in terms of the strength of your tendons, ligaments, bones, flexibility. It all matters. Also, precise movement towards a target. If you're going to catch an object, a lot of times you have what we call an agonist burst, followed by an antagonist burst with an eccentric contraction, which helps you to get in that target and not embarrass yourself, hopefully. Okay, co-contractions, like I said, stabilize joints, bones. They're actually critically important when someone is doing weightlifting. One of the main reasons weightlifting helps to protect bones and tendons and ligaments, it actually puts a little bit of mechanical stress on them, and those tissues adapt. They produce more collagen, if it's bones, more minerals as well, more protein that gives those tissues their strength, stiffness, ductility, toughness, all the stuff that we need. So again, when you're analyzing a movement, I usually try to go with the more proximal joint first. So let's look at the shoulder joint. It's moving like that. If you forget, if you get a little bit confused, try to put that person in the anatomical position, pretend that torso is upright, and think about the shoulder. One of the things you can do is forget about the elbow extension for a minute. Think about what the shoulder is doing. It starts here and then moves like that. So that's got to be horizontal adduction, right? And that means the pectoralis major and the anterior deltoid. Those are the muscles producing that movement. For the elbow, this one's a little bit more straightforward. We've got elbow extension. That means the triceps brachii are the main agonist muscles there. So as you go through this anatomical analysis of movement in your first laboratory, you're going to get a chance to be able to integrate this material that includes, I bent it a little while ago. There we go. The Sieg and Adams text. There it is. In the 5th edition, this is actually the 5th edition. How about that? You can see I've earmarked many of those pages, bookmarked them. So 11 through 12, 61 through 73, 121 through 126, 158 through 161, 170 through 171. Let's look at 158. So some of the first pages are about bony landmarks. Those are critically important because they tell you where you are. So for example, most people think that the hip joint is, I'm going to demonstrate, up here, and that is the iliac crest. A lot of people put their hands on the hips. It's actually not your hips. Your hips are down there. There's something called a greater trochanter. That's this part of the femur that sticks out. If you go 2 fingers above that, that's actually where the hip joint is located, as the head of the femur, which is really round, goes into the acetabulum. So that's going to be part of the ischium and ilium and pubis muscles. They actually all come together right at that hip joint. So bony landmarks, that's on page 11 and 12. We open to page 61. These sections are going to focus on muscle actions. What are the adductor muscles? So for each movement, we go over which muscles are most important. The helper muscles are in italices, and then in regular font, you're going to see the major muscles. That's what you're going to be using throughout the class. So in this class, we're going to use anatomy. We're going to use mathematics to try to explain things using anatomical analysis and also using mechanical analysis. And then we'll break things down and talk about material properties and health of the individual connective tissues. So part of the reason that the anatomical analysis of movement is so important, it really helps us in terms of specificity of training, particularly important in adults. In kids, you can see actually more systemic effects than you see in adults, including like bone mass, but you don't see that in adults. If you want to be able to kick that soccer ball harder, you're going to have to work on muscles that extend the knee joint, flex the hip joint. At the foot, let's see what we probably have some pronation and supination. We're also going to use the hip joint not only in flexion, but also we're going to see some medial and lateral rotation. So obviously you don't want to train this soccer player and emphasize muscles and joint movements the same way that we would in a shot putter. So this is Randy Matson. Randy Matson's one of 2 Aggies who've won gold medal or multiple gold medals in the case of Randy Matson in the U.S. Olympics. And he's at that ideal 37, 38 degree angle. That's the ideal launch angle. So that when he's producing that movement, it's going to be horizontal adduction of the shoulder in the dominant arm. The reason that that's important is that where you can get the greatest muscle mass. If you just threw the shot put up in flexion, flexion doesn't have nearly as much muscle mass. We only have the upper pectoralis major involved in that type of movement, and that means the clavicular head, but not the sternal head. So you don't get nearly as much force doing this as opposed to doing that. And that's what you want to do by tilting the body, getting that angle just right. He's going to be able to throw that shot put upward just like that at that 37, 38 degree angle. Okay, some adaptations. We talked a little bit about the hip joint, a little bit more about the hip joint, and there's the femur. There's its kind of optimal angle. So in humans, it's about a 55 to 60 degree angle. That's B right here. So you notice it's fairly steep. The advantage is for being upright. So when someone is taking a step, that femur is going to be at an angle where the knee is on the inside because our hip joint's out here and our foot has to be underneath the center of gravity. So the femur and the tibia, but most of the femur has to point towards the inside. So when that happens, look what happens to the neck of the femur. It's almost vertical, bearing as much weight as possible, reducing the amount of shear force. And then you have a fairly long neck. Here's our cousin, the chimpanzee. It has a long neck too. That means the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus muscles, which compared with a cat or a dog, we've moved to the side. That way, these muscles produce hip abduction. Your gluteus maximus produces, excuse me, hip extension. Here's the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. They produce abduction of the hip. They insert here on the greater trochanter and then come up to the top of the pelvis, top of the iliac. So again, this is the iliac crest. A lot of people will point to this and say that's the hip joint or that's the hip. These are not the hips. The hips are down here. And this is where bony landmarks come in because we want to use them to be able to mark like the hip joint correctly, the knee joint correctly, the ankle correctly. The ankle is right beneath the lateral malleolus. That's the outside of the distal end of the fibula. And mark the shoulder, mark the elbow, mark the major joints in the body. So humans, in order to be biped, in order to be hunter-gatherers, we needed that neck of the femur to be at just the right angle. This flatter angle is better for either quadrupeds, maybe the ability to be able to move back and forth on your legs from side to side, but not really moving forward fast. So this helps us not only to be able to walk, but to be able to run. And to run at a speed that forces a lot of animals to gallop. And when they gallop, they get hot. It costs a lot of energy to gallop. So one of the other adaptations has to do with our hair and our skin. A lot of times when you look, we don't see much hair unless we look up to the light. And then, yeah, you can see these really fine hairs. They're everywhere. We've got hair all over our body. I mean, sometimes because of secondary sex characteristics, we have thicker hair in certain areas. But for the most part, we have these light hairs. And then we've got a lot of skin exposed. And we can distribute blood towards the skin, like a radiator system. What does all this mean? This is great for heat dissipation. So we can work, we can farm, we can do hunter gathering. And it means we're not going to overheat as much, but we got to have water because we sweat a lot. So the sweating, the skin, the thin hair, blood flow in the skin, a high surface area to mass ratio, that's great for dissipating heat. That's one of the things that makes us special. Here's another thing, the arch of the foot. You notice this arch has some connective tissue like the plantar fascia, the calcaneonavicular ligament, etc. These tissues can actually store force and store energy like a spring. So the arch of the foot, an arch provides a lot of support. So if you think about a bridge, or you think about aqueducts in Rome, an arch is really good at resisting against large compressive forces. Because when we're running, it can be actually 2.5, even 3 times our body weight. Chimpanzees and other simian friends, they're not able to handle that because they don't have an arch. The arch of the human foot has been around for 1.2 million years, possibly a precursor up to about 3 billion years. When the arch of the foot developed, when we changed our hip joint, also when we adapted our shoulder joint, it allowed us to be able to free up our hands to use tools. When we use tools, our brains developed. The brain development in humans and human-like creatures happened after the adaptations in the hip, after the adaptations in the arch of the foot. The mechanical stuff came first. So why did we need this? Well, the area around the Sahara and sub-Saharan Africa in the last few million years has been drying out. And you notice the Sahara is now a big fat desert. At one point, it wasn't as much of a desert as it is now. And as that part of Africa was drying out, it was going from jungles, which our ancestors came from, to grasslands. So that meant that standing up was important. This is why human height, one of the reasons why it has some value, even subconsciously among us. We think about maybe a tall person as being an advantage. Well, it was in Africa because we didn't have lawnmowers back then. And so the grass grew high, you had to see over grass. So, and also you had to be able to reach up into a tree and get fruit and everything else. But the main thing was seeing over the grasslands. So that was a huge advantage. Also being taller allowed us to be able to see farther and scout when we as teams were looking for a prey or looking for nuts and fruits, maybe looking for trees. So we're omnivores. We eat pretty much everything, as you probably know. And if you've seen a lot of cooking shows, you know, people eat, there's a lot of different stuff that people will eat. Some of the delicacies are certainly pretty unusual. So we don't have that square hip joint. That neck of the femur is ideal for being a biped. Heat dissipation allows us to run. The gluteus maximus in humans is maximus. It's large. In a chimpanzee, it's not. It's really very small. So if you think about, well, is my butt big? Or it's supposed to be big. But I can't tell my wife that. If she asks me a question, hey, is it big? And I have to say no. And I always say no, or else I'm in big, big trouble. But in reality, the gluteus maximus is supposed to be maximus. How does that help us? Well, it helps us in running. It helps us in climbing, whether it's climbing a hill, climbing a set of stairs, etc., going over rough terrain. This is where the gluteus maximus helps. And remember, the gluteus medius and minimus are there for hip abduction. They're the only thing between you and the ground when you take a step. When you take a step. So this is all about helping us as hunter-gatherers, whether we're going to the grocery store, going out looking for food, or farming, because we actually have some farmer genes. There's that neck of the femur. Again, when you're taking a step, when you're running or walking, that's actually putting that neck of the femur at almost a vertical angle. So that's really helpful. That allows you to be able to, with the arch of the foot, storing spring energy, the neck of the femur, with the adaptations moving the gluteus and medius to the outside, so they're hip abductors, increasing the mass of the gluteus maximus. All of those mean we're born to run, we're born to pick up and carry weights, gather stuff, bring it back to the village, whether it be water, whether it be nuts, berries, fruit, game, etc. So it's all about carrying that weight. So that's the end of our discussion for today. This is, in a sense, why we're built the way we are. These mechanical adaptations allow us to do tremendous things. Really exciting. Let's get off around. I can't fade down, so I'm going to say have a safe one out there, and we'll see you next time.